When I was near the beginning of my watercolor journey, one of my greatest struggles was getting muddy color. I was trying to do everything right, and yet I still ended up with colors that were dull and lifeless. And maybe you can relate. Welcome to Sunlit Brushstrokes. My name is Jessica, and today I'm excited to be sharing with you the medium that actually unlocked watercolor for me. It was actually a watercolor pencil course that unlocked watercolor and color theory to me in a new way. And I'm excited to be sharing that with you. And not only that, but I discovered that watercolor pencils are a perfect medium for beginner watercolor artists. And I'm going to be sharing with you the reasons why that is. Let's go ahead and get started. The first reason I think watercolor pencils are perfect for beginners is because they're simply a matter of coloring. Now, we all have some practice with basic coloring techniques, don't we? And that's the beauty of watercolor pencil, is that you can just color with whatever coloring techniques you already use. And you can color loose, simple, almost in a scribbling motion when you're laying those first initial layers of color down. Once I've got my initial base layer, you're going to see I start layering on some other colors. This is where I start looking at my reference photo to decide where those shadows need to go and where there's some natural color variation within the subject matter, in this case, the flower. Now, this is where that watercolor pencil course made all the difference in the world for me. Up to this point in my art journey, I was creating shadow colors by mixing complementary colors together. You've probably heard of this concept before, but basically, if I was painting something yellow, I would mix some purple into that yellow to create a shadow color. If I was painting something orange, I would mix some blue in. Or if I was painting something red, I was mixing in some green, or vice versa. And this can work in some situations. The problem is you're gonna wind up with muddy color. And this is where that watercolor pencil course changed everything for me. When I was bringing in my homework for the watercolor pencil course, the teacher noticed that some of my colors were duller than what she anticipated. And that's because I was taking artistic license and throwing some extra complementary color in. I explained to her what I was doing, and I still remember her standing there and taking a giant step across the floor and said, "You know what you're doing? You're taking the color wheel and you're going a giant step right across, instead of taking this gentle step-by-step incremental approach around the color wheel." And as I continued taking classes with her in watercolor pencil and regular color pencil, I began to understand what a difference it makes to take that incremental approach. And once I learned how to do this in watercolor pencil, it made it so much easier to apply it to watercolor. Let me show you how this works in watercolor pencil. How to lay down your color. And I find this is actually easier to understand using colored pencil or watercolor pencil. I actually did both mediums, and I think they both kind of the skills transfer. But when you understand this, you can apply it to watercolor. I just found the whole concept transferred really nicely in my mind, and I was able to quit getting mud in my watercolor when I understood how to avoid the mud in my watercolor pencil. So I'm going to wheel. So we have our yellow, and then I do have yellow pencils that work their way towards the orange, and then orange, then some red oranges, and kind of a red color. This is more of a purple magenta, and then finally a purple. So we kind of are working our way this direction. So that's what we're going to do with our flowers today, is work this way. Now, if depending on what you're painting, if you're doing some green leaves, you would come this way, right? But we're going to start out with our flower, and I'm just going to show you how I would apply the color using this scrap of paper. So I'm going to go in the order of these pencils, and I'm going to lay down. It might be easier to work from left to right, whatever way works for you. You can go from top to bottom. I'm going to lay down our brightest yellow, and sometimes you might take the approach of putting less as you work your way to the right side here. So we're working from left to right. But then I'm going to go ahead and take this more golden color, work my way the same direction, only I didn't put any at the very, very far left side. Then I'm going to take the more orangey one, and I'm going to show you too, you don't need every single pencil color here to get the results you're after. You can mix colors when you're working in watercolor pencil. So now my orange, and you can see every time I take a step to another color, I leave a little space with the other color before it showing. So like here, my red orange, I'm making sure you still see some orange with my red orange. And the actual color names don't necessarily matter as much as the color itself. So that one is more of a red. And then finally, this one is kind of crossed as a purple. And you can actually even go darker. You can see we worked our way all the way around here or so. But you could even, if you need to get darker, you could even work your way towards the blue. And I have an indigo blue here. It's a very dark navy blue, but you can put that at the very end if you really need some dark. So there's a little tip as well. Probably won't use it too soon in the painting. We may use it today though, in our flower. And then I'm going to show you what happens when I add water. So I've got a damp brush here. I've got my water. And with watercolor pencil especially, it's helpful to use less water, and it allows you to use less water. So I'm just going to come using this kind of back and forth, almost scrubbing motion, and go ahead and moisten things working from left to right. So as I come this way, I'm not trying, you see I kind of move back a little bit. Don't want to move backwards into where you've gone. You just want to keep moving toward. So now you can see that's exactly what I'm doing here on our flower. I'm using kind of a yellow-orange color, and I'm just laying that in, basic coloring, but I'm looking at the reference photo to figure out where my lights and darks are going to go, because in some areas I'm going to want to leave the flower that nice bright yellow, and other times I'm going to go a little darker, and so this is where I'm using that reference photo as a guide. Then I'll move into my orange color, and then I'm going to move into the red-orange. And you'll notice that as I go with darker colors, I do start to change my coloring techniques so that I kind of follow the direction, the flow of those creases and folds that naturally happen within the petals. Now with watercolor pencil, you have options for blending. You can go ahead and blend all your colors from light to dark, like I showed you on that initial color swatch. But the other thing you can do is work in layers, similar to how we work in watercolor. And this is actually my preference if you're trying to avoid mud. So at this stage, I'm going to wet and blend everything, and then when it's dry, I'll come in and add more layers and more detail with darker colors. The beauty of watercolor pencil though is that unlike traditional watercolor, you can actually work fairly dry, which makes it so much easier to control the water, especially when you're just starting out. One of the big secrets for blending in watercolor pencil is to start out by blending your lights first. Here you can see I'm just gently adding some water with my brush onto the bright yellow section of this petal. I'm kind of stroking it in the direction of the creases and folds, but making sure that I stay in my light areas. Then when I'm happy with those lights, I can work my way into the darks. And here you can see that I'm blending the orange-red color. And then I use my reference photo to guide me as to how much of those dark colors I actually want to pull down into my light areas. Right now, I'm working wet on wet, and that's allowing me to get some nice, smooth transitions, and the blending is happening quite easily here. One of the huge game changers for me was learning how important it is to dry between layers. Once I've blended this entire flower out with my water, I go ahead and dry the painting thoroughly, and that dry paper is going to allow me to add more layers and more depth and some beautiful rich shadow colors. And this is where you can start to see the painting come to life. I've transitioned further down the color wheel, and I'm using deep reds, a purple tone magenta, and then finally some dark blue in order to get these beautiful deep shadows and details. Again, I'm following the color swatch guide that I created at the beginning, where my color choices are stepping, not jumping their way around the color wheel. And then I'm going to go ahead and blend just like I did before. So I've got my wet brush, I'm coming in to my lightest areas first, I'll blend those around, and then I'll work my way into the medium darks, and then my darkest darks. So I'm blending in the same order that I applied the watercolor pencil. If you would like to see the real-time process of how I blend, you can find that in my full-length tutorial that's available on my Etsy shop. I'll include a link for that in the description below. Now there are some instances where you can jump around the color wheel, and that's when you want a more dull colored shadow, like I'm creating in this little petal here. The secret to getting some vibrancy and not mud is that all the yellow colors on this little flower are dry, and then I come back in and use this nice purpley kind of magenta color to create that slightly muddy and yet still colorful shadow. And the key to making this work is the fact that I have blended and then dried that initial layer first. And the nice thing with watercolor pencil is that if you want to keep adding layers, you can. Just dry everything that's wet, and then you can come back in and color those shapes in, and then just wet and blend them the amount that you feel you need to get the effect you're after. Sometimes when you're at the very end of the painting, you might even just decide to leave your watercolor pencil dry. I tend to work in layers when I'm doing the more detailed, intricate parts of my painting. Then when I move on to the leaves, I actually am going to be working quite simply. I'm going to lay pretty much all of my green colors down first. Again, I'm going to follow the direction of the color wheel, working from my yellows to my light green and then to my darker greens. I'm really just laying them in with really loose, simple techniques. I don't really want a lot of detail in these leaves. Finally, one of my favorite things about watercolor pencil is how easy it is to achieve amazing textures with very little effort. Here I'm layering several colors down to create the center of my flower, but the real sparkle happens when I start to wet it. And here's a little bonus tip. You can even pick up a watercolor pencil and use it almost like it's a palette. You can just use your wet brush and remove a little bit of pigment and drop it right into your painting. If you would like to see the full process for how I do the center of this flower, you'll definitely want to check out my full-length tutorial that's available on my Etsy shop. You'll also get a traceable outline so that you can follow along with me step by step, from the first layer into the detail layers, and finally the leaves and gorgeous flower center. You can find a link for that in the description below. Oh, and we can't forget to talk about blending these simple leaves. Just like I colored them really simply, I'm blending them really simply, following that same light to dark method that I showed you earlier. I wet the light shapes and blend them, then I move into the dark shapes. And at this point, I can decide just how much of the dark I want to pull into my light areas. Sometimes I'll leave my light areas quite light, other times I might pull a little more darkness into them. It's kind of a choice that you can make based on the color that you're after. And again, the beauty of watercolor pencil is that if you decide you want to go a little darker or add another color, while your painting's wet, it is so easy to just pick up a pencil, like I say, use it as if it's dry paint on a palette, and add a little extra color in. This leaf has partly dried, but I decided that I wanted a little smoother texture, and so here you can see just adding a little bit more water and just gently massaging those pigments around can get you just a very, very beautiful, smooth leaf. If you ever find doing this lifts a little more paint than you'd like, you can always just, again, pick up one of those watercolor pencils and drop a little extra color in. You can learn more about watercolor pencils by clicking on my watercolor pencil playlist. I have beginner-friendly tutorials as well as a few for intermediate level students. In the meantime, I hope this video has brought a little taste of God's beauty and peace into your everyday life, and that it's inspired you to continue enjoying your own creative journey. See you again soon. Bye!